Welcome to the Freight Project Podcast, brought to you by Ceresys, a North American third-party logistics company providing shippers transportation management, technology, and solutions.
On today's The Freight Project Podcast episode, I welcome Roy Hauser, a longtime Ceresys sales agent. As with any first-time guest, you'll get to know Roy's background in the logistics industry, primarily focused on providing solutions to shippers over a career that spans 3 decades. On the episode, Roy and I will have a great discussion around why more shippers are turning to integrating TMS with other supply chain systems as they see the value of TMS integration in today's shipping environment. On the episode, Roy will answer the following questions. What is integration between a TMS and, say, an ERP or other supply chain systems? What are some of the reasons why a shipper would begin to think about integrating another supply chain system into a TMS? When a shipper has seen the value of TMS integration, what do they have to do to get ready for the integration of their systems to a TMS? Once a shipper integrates into a TMS, how do their processes change? And what benefits did they start to see in the short-term value of TMS integration? Then you'll understand when would integration not be something we'd suggest for a shipper. And finally, I capture Roy's thoughts on the current state of the freight industry and if he continues to see shippers looking at the value of TMS integration. We hope you enjoy this episode of the Freight Project Podcast. Hello, Roy, and thanks so much for being on as a valued subject matter expert on the Freight Project Podcast. As with any first-time guest, let's first get to know who you are. So, Roy, please tell the great listeners of our growing Freight Project Podcast out there what you do here at Ceresys and your experience in the logistics industry.
Hi, Adam. Thanks for having me on. I'm a sales agent, obviously, for Ceresys, and I'm dating myself, but I've been in the logistics arena since, believe it or not, 1987. In fact, for much of that time, prior to joining Ceresys, our CEO, Steve Ludvigsen, was the logistics overlap for either myself or one of my sales teams during those days. We were both in a prior logistics sales organization together. I joined Ceresys very near the beginning and actually signed my first customer in August of 1998. They are still one of my best references today.
Well, that's really interesting, because I think one of the things that struck me when I first came to Ceresys about 7 years ago was just the retention rate of our customers and the fact that you still have that customer 2 decades later. And I hope that doesn't make you feel bad when I say it like that. It makes my mom feel bad when I say her age in decades. But that's a long amount of experience. And I think that really positions us quite well for our discussion today. As you know, our goal here on the Freight Project Podcast is to bring folks on who have vast experience and are able to impart upon the listeners out there, hopefully, some good wisdom that they can take back to their jobs in order to be more efficient and more effective. And as the Farmers Insurance commercial goes, Roy has seen a thing or two, so he's able to give you a few tips or two. So given that vast experience where you've signed up Ceresys customers for 2 decades and worked in the logistics industry for a bit longer than that, right alongside Steve Ludvigsen and Steve Rao, who started the company 2 decades ago, one of the things that I think has become much more important as of late, as the freight industry continues to be tech heavy and there's more and more technology solutions and more supply chain systems out there, is the value of integrating various supply chain systems like an ERP into a TMS like our Ceresys Rater, for example. Now, we've developed an integration process that we call here at Ceresys Bridge. But before we get into the reasons that integration is valuable, let's make sure we take a step back to the basics. We always want to make sure we're on the same page. So can you explain to our listeners what is integration between a TMS and maybe something like an ERP?
Yes, Adam, thank you for that. I don't feel old. Well, maybe not too old. But yes, it feels like we're doing something right, and that's a very positive thing. So to answer your question, integration, I guess in my mind, is basically data flow between 2 different programs, whether that be a TMS, a transportation management system, and an enterprise resource planning system, an ERP, or an order entry program, or whatever the case. And the idea is to streamline your order cycle and improve that information flow between those two programs and give you automation of process within that. And that's basically all that it is. It's a closed loop electronic order cycle.
Well, and it may seem a bit rudimentary, right, to go back to what integration is, but I think, as I said a little bit ago, the freight industry, the logistics industry, and the larger supply chain continue to get tech heavy. And one of the things that supply chain leaders have talked about for years is this term visibility. It's all about wanting to get more information, right? Just as the same way of making sure, that we're on the same page with what integration is and maybe what integration is not. As supply chain leaders take on these massive projects and they go after this, initiative of improving visibility and getting more data and being able to analyze that data so they can continuously improve, they're going to need to know everything going into this integration. Who are the right players and what they need to do. So, what are some of the reasons, though, before we get into what that supply chain leader needs to do as far as assembling their team, why would a shipper even want to integrate supply chain systems? Are there a lot of benefits to this? What are some of the reasons they're taking these projects on more and more?
Great question. And if you understand that integration really gives the shipper the ability to pull down data for shipments that are ready to be processed. And then once those are completed and shipped, to put that data back into their system so that they can invoice automatically, whatever the case may be. Then one of the most prevalent reasons for this type of process and integration is high volume applications. In order to capture data and do anything else within an organization, you first have to be able to handle the basic process of shipping a package or shipping an order. And automating that, obviously, in a high volume application will then give you efficiencies in many, many different areas across your supply chain while still giving you integrity of that data. So it may become necessary to eliminate keystrokes, add accuracy within that order cycle. Integration is most likely going to be the best method. Automatic release of inventory can be triggered. There are other processes, again, invoicing. Additionally, shippers are looking for a faster, more accurate method of invoicing. And the faster you invoice, obviously, the faster you get paid. You're reducing the daily outstanding accounts receivables. That idea over the course of a full year can be a huge number for a shipper. Integration can help accomplish this. Not to mention that improved accuracy will also enhance the customer experience. It's difficult to put a number on the value of customer retention, but it is all about customer satisfaction.
Yeah, I think a good maybe a good metaphor, another industry to think about this, right? To really, remind folks that the customer is at the center of all of this. Really, it ties back to the customer. They have so many more options now to get products out there. So let's think about a restaurant today, right? We have traditional fast food. He either had dine-in or drive-through. Pretty simple for restaurant operations to scale, have a bunch of locations. However, thanks to the power of the consumer and the internet and the growing use of technology in the restaurant space like Uber Eats, the point of sale system for that restaurant operator has become much more complex and more rife with error. And essentially, think of an Uber Eats delivery situation where an order comes in, and in this case, let's say it's an Uber Eats is equitable to an ERP, and that order comes in, and the cashier says, okay, it's not integrated. I have to rekey it into my point of sale system in order to kick off the production of that meal, and then ultimately the delivery. Well, if you don't key in the right thing, and you give someone onions on their burger and they hate onions because your rekeying order was poor and you didn't have it integrated, they're going to be really mad. And they're probably going to have an option to go to another restaurant, or they're going to give you bad reviews. And so you've wasted time, and now you've upset a customer. So the value of integration for the supply chain is very similar. And it sounds like, making sure that you put the customer at the heart of it is what you're saying.
Or Adam, what if they are allergic to onions? Not even that they dislike them, they're allergic. Then
it could mean life or
customer.
death. Yeah. And I think that's what's important. And so, those considerations, when it comes to integration, pretty much are going to paint themselves, right? Because losing customers today is really not a good thing for business. And, once that shipper has decided to go down that route, they see the value in it. And I think increasingly they're going to see the value of it as different systems come into place. Something like an Uber Eats that transform restaurant, we're going to have similar applications that come in. They're going to transform the supply chain. So the supply chain leader has to, assemble their team and get ready for integration. What do they need to do to get ready to integrate their other systems to a TMS?
First, I would suggest that a shipper gain a detailed understanding of their order cycle. What data points go where within both their digital world and their manual data storage world. There also needs to be an understanding of why they store these data points the way they store them. Obviously, intellectual property, corporate history, these are all essential things for any company. But sometimes we get lost and we lose the forest for the trees. What I mean is, for efficiency's sake, understand why you are taking certain steps within your order cycle, why you're capturing certain data points and why you're capturing and where you're putting them and why you're putting them there. Is it because you've always done it that way and certain steps bring no value to the profitability of the health of the organization, but again, you've always done it that way? Well, you should be spending time understanding those and if you need those steps. Additionally, a shipper needs to review the current computer architecture and if there are any significant changes or updates looming in the future. All of these points will affect an overall integration plan.
Yeah. And you got to, just like the Avengers, you got to assemble your team and get the right players. And inherent in what you're saying there is that, one, the supply chain people probably need to be there that are involved in those processes and understanding the underlying goals that you're trying to achieve.
Absolutely.
And then it sounds like maybe some technology people need to be involved just to make sure that, are you really prepared from a technology landscape to do this the right way, right? And so, I think when we have customers who come to us here at Ceresys, more and more we're pushing integration, more and more they're asking about integration. Those conversations are now matching up. And you've had some real world experience with this. And, you've outlined some of the reasons why a shipper would undertake the initiative, what to consider when getting ready for integration. So let's talk about a customer you've had. Can you briefly explain what drove this customer to integrate their systems into our TMS? Had they done this before? Was it you who suggested it? Or what were their reasons why?
One of the things that I like most about Ceresys is that I believe we're a technology company first and foremost, and we have been integrating almost since day one. DOS applications, e-commerce, XML integration, ODBC is an old version of screen scraping, other people call it. There's lots of different types. We obviously are very heavily involved in API integration today. So I've been involved in many, many applications. One of the best examples that comes to mind was a fairly large shipper. They had to process approximately 30 to 45 shipments per day. And additionally, they had a special program with one large customer that had one particular carrier. And this program involved, a cross-dock rating program. This large customer, they needed to rate shipments from point A to point B, but on the BOL show the delivery address for point C and ultimate point C. So immediately I started about discussing integration with them because of the volume and the complexity. And we also used one of our cross-dock rating capabilities and incorporated this step into the integration process to make the entire program flow and make it fluid process, but still handle the unique needs of this one customer. We also helped them start capturing dimensions, which they had never done before, but definitely knew they needed to start capturing because of the direct trend within the industry.
Yeah, and I think we talked a lot about that on a recent webinar we had with our parcel partner, right? Where dimensions have been in place for quite some time. And we talked about that move in the LTL and the freight side going towards dimension simply because of the ability for algorithms and optimization to be much more efficient once we have better math and maybe not some arbitrary classes based on, the best way to describe a particular item.
Sure.
So that makes sense. And it sounds like you have a lot to say on that. So we may need to talk about that on a future podcast, Roy.
Absolutely.
Well, those are really good reasons. It looks like we helped and provided a lot of value there to just get them more efficient, make them seamless, make them capture more data, have them prepared for the future that might be more dimensional, right? So once they did integrate into our TMS, how did their processes change? And what benefits did they start seeing in the short term after integration? And then what benefits long-term did they see?
Well, there was a significant increase in order accuracy, while also bringing a significant reduction in processing time. It was very successful for them. The customer had never attempted integration before, and they really didn't have a TMS or any other type of program that would allow this type of process. So they were kind of held back. Upon my suggestion for integration, obviously, and a review of the improved order cycle, they agreed, understanding that this step was really essential for controlled positive growth of their organization. And actually, it kind of sounds strange, but this integration program led to the next weak link in their process, in their order cycle, because before, routing and BOL creation were a challenge for them. Now it was a staging that needed to be addressed. They had many, many staging issues, but this was never as critical before because other parts of the order cycle were holding them back, the BOL creation and the rating routing process. So we actually opened new doors for them to continue to improve and become more profitable across their supply chain.
Yeah, that's really a nice benefit to be able to see where are your other weakest links. But it's tough to, I think about the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And you got to have the basics. You got to have, shelter, food, and then you can start to do the cool stuff and move up that pyramid of adding more value to your life and going after true happiness. And in the freight world, if your technology is aligned and you're starting to see some process efficiency, you're able to get out of the weeds of them. And you can start looking at what other is there? What other else can we optimize? And that's really a great case study, to help convince other shippers of the value of integration to a TMS. And so given those results for this large enterprise shipper, would you say integration's right for every shipper? When would integration really not be something you'd suggest for a shipper?
Oh, definitely. Integration is not for every shipper. There are computer architecture considerations. There are cost considerations. Volume, obviously, as I've mentioned, is one of the key factors, but it's not always the determining factor for integration. But it definitely is the biggest and usually the most prevalent factor. However, lower volume shippers, sometimes the complexity of the order data or just the complexity of classification of freight or the number of keystrokes for their size of orders can mean that integration might be a more efficient method, even though their volume may not be as significant. Low volume shippers also have the luxury of time. They don't have as much time invested into the actual process. So you have to consider all of these things to decide if integration will be helpful for you. There needs to be integration in a case where it brings profitability. But if there's no benefit, it's the cost benefits situation again. If there isn't enough benefit for the cost and the effort to put it in place, then integration doesn't make sense, and every situation is different.
Okay. Well, then, if any shipper looks at, their practice of freight management and they feel that there are any areas in their current order cycle that they're uncomfortable with, or maybe they feel like this is a lot harder than it feels like, that may be a great impetus to look towards a path of integration. Is that correct?
Yes, I would agree. It's a good first step. Okay. And especially with the technology available today, there are a lot of ways to integrate with minimal effort.
So it doesn't hurt to ask.
Absolutely.
It doesn't hurt to ask. And I think that's a great question. And just like customers are empowered more and more, and shippers are our customers, shippers should also be demanding and asking questions of any potential partner like a Cerasis and, really look at it from an outcome-based type approach, right? And that way you can align the right solutions to your practice and make sure you get what you need as a shipper. And I know that here at Cerasis, we welcome those questions. We want to make sure we give the best advice. And sometimes that means we're not the best fit. Oftentimes it does. But, that's the way we do business in the spirit of continuous improvement, no matter how you improve. So finally, before I have you leave here with your experience in the logistics industry and kind of seeing things over time, I know it's been very interesting for me in the last 7 years, not coming from the industry, to see so much change just in those 7 years. So I'd love to get your thoughts on the state of the industry in general right now. It seems we've got a bit of a softening in the truckload market, somewhat in the freight market. The usual spring rush came a bit later this year. We probably won't be as tight at any point this year as we were in 2018. Could this put shippers in a false sense of perhaps not needing to be as efficient as possible? And do you come across in your sales conversation shippers who might say something like, it's a shipper's market right now, and I don't need any tools like a TMS or any help to stabilize my freight? If so, what do you say to that?
Yeah, there's a lot of noise out there in the market that says it's changing and it's moving more towards the middle. And yes, the truckload market has softened. I don't believe the LTL market has softened as much. There's still a lot of freight out there moving. Capacity is still very tight. So you have to be careful. The big concern for me is that carriers are adding technology and have been at an alarming rate through this entire capacities crunch, I guess, for lack of a better term. This means that the market has changed and will never look like it did before. So don't be caught up with a false sense of comfort that, it's a shipper's market again, because it's different than it's ever been. And it's important for every shipper to have technology and stay on the leading edge of both efficiency and data collection and storage to keep ahead or stay ahead of all the changes coming from the carrier side. Those that don't will erode margin and profit, both short-term and long-term.
Well, there you heard it, folks. From a man who's been around and seen a few things in his time in freight, he continues to see more technology. And guess what? That means probably more systems, some confusion, and ultimately you're going to need some help in order to make all those data flows work. And it looks like integration increasingly is that process to undertake in order to get the most out of any investment in your supply chain systems. At the end of the day, you're not buying those things just to have them. You're buying them to be more efficient, gain an ROI back from that investment. And as we said, reach your desired outcomes that you've been stating with your team. So, Roy, really appreciate you outlining the value of integration, kind of some of the considerations, the benefits, and, sharing a real world case study. Definitely appreciate your expertise here on the Freight Project podcast. Clearly, we're going to talk about the growing dimensioning of freight on our next one. So thanks again for being a guest on the Freight Project podcast.
My pleasure, Adam. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And for all of our listeners, thank you always for tuning in to each episode. We'll see you on the next episode. Take care.